Thank you very much, Joanne. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation to speak to you all tonight. Through my line of work at the UW Insect Diagnostic Lab, I get to see and identify all sorts of insects for people. Typically, in a given year, about 2,500 identification requests come in, and it's all across the board. But in a lot of cases, it's kind of that proverbial squeaky wheel gets the oil. It's the insects that are doing something bad. They may be the pests in our homes or in our yards or in our gardens that get our attention. And so I deal with plenty of questions like that. What is this chewing on my viburnum or my cabbage, and what can I do about it? But when you think about insects as a whole, in Wisconsin, we have somewhere in the ballpark of around 20,000 or so species, roughly. Then you got to add all the spiders and related arthropods on top of that. Worldwide, there's over 1 million described species of insects. And if you were to break it down in terms of a percentage, it's probably 5% or less of all our insects are genuine pests. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of insects are beneficial in one way or another. And there's plenty of cases where I've come to really learn and appreciate this over time that context matters so much. And we'll talk about some examples where you can have an insect that in one situation we may not be happy about it, but in other situations it can really be helping us out. A good example of that would be things like social wasps. If you've got that big paper mache wasp nest right outside your front door, you're not going to be happy about it. But if that nest is in the back corner of your yard, they can be excellent predators. And we're going to talk about that. So tonight, I really want to focus on the beneficial insects. These I feel are very much underappreciated. In a lot of cases, kind of they go unrecognized. They fly under the radar because folks don't realize what they are, how abundant they are, and how they may be helping you out. And there's plenty of real world situations in your own yard or garden where, for example, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten photographs from someone. It's a plant, it's loaded with aphids, and their next question is, what can I spray about it? And my response is, time out, don't spray anything because there's aphids, but I see evidence of parasitism, and 80% of those aphids are parasitized, or there's abundant predators present. There's lady beetles, lacewings, 3 to 5 other things. And my advice is wait because the cavalry has come in and they're taking care of the problem for you. And if you spray, you might actually set yourself back a little bit. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So let's jump into it. And first of all, what do I mean when I say beneficial insects? And also, when I interact with the public, folks like to ask the question of, is this a good bug or a bad bug? And in my mind, it's not that clear cut. It's more of a spectrum or a continuum. There's insects that do good things, there's insects that do bad things. Most of our insects fall somewhere in there, where maybe depending on the context, it might be a little of each or more of one than other. But when I'm talking about beneficial insects, I'm really referring to some insect, or it could be applied to other organisms as well, but some insect or creature that is providing an ecosystem service. And that's basically a fancy way of saying it's something that Mother Nature is doing so that you and I don't have to. In a lot of cases, we don't even think about this. We take it for granted. But just as a good example, if we went to the grocery store and we didn't have insects as pollinators providing that ecosystem service of pollination, the produce department would essentially be gone because so many of our fruits and vegetables rely on insect pollinators. So when we think about these ecosystem services, we can break it down into a number of key categories. I'm going to focus on 3 of them today. And especially, I'm going to talk a lot about the first and then some on the second and third. I've got entire talks on pollination, for example. Just recognize these are not the only ecosystem services. There's a lot of benefits that insects provide such as soil aeration, serving as a base of food webs and things like that. But I want to focus on especially biological control because I feel in our yards and gardens, this is a key service that insects can provide to us. But also, insects can serve to a certain extent as nature's garbage men and recyclers. They play a heavy role in decomposition, nutrient cycling and recycling, and things like that. Pollination is another key one as well that we'll talk about as well. So, as I said, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about biological control. This is something that I'm very passionate about. It's fascinating to learn about these things. And we're going to go through a survey of some of the common examples of biological controls, or sometimes we call these natural enemies. These are predators and parasites that help control some of the pests in our yards and gardens. So, what's biological control? In very simplest terms, this is the use of biological control agents or biological agents. So we're not talking about chemical control. Biological or living things used to manage pest populations. Another way of thinking about that is using Mother Nature against pests. If it's really rainy, for example, there are entomopathogenic or insect infecting fungi and bacteria and viruses that can pop up. That's what we saw in the state last year with the invasive spongy moth. We finally got rain at the right time. Populations, they came down sick with these diseases, they crashed. So that's a kind of naturally occurring biological control. And when you think about biological control, if you break it down into kind of its simplest ways you could go about doing this, there's kind of two main ways I want to talk about. And if you were to take a course on biological control at UW-Madison, you'd learn more details about this. You could split some finer hairs. But for tonight, I want you to think of it as kind of the direct and indirect route. So the direct route would be to directly increase populations of predators or parasitic insects in an area. Sounds simple in theory. The challenge is we can't just drive down to Fleet Farm or Farm and Fleet or Menards and buy a bunch of lacewings or lady beetles or things like that. They're hard to find. There are sometimes specific companies that sell biological control organisms, but they're often costly. You can't ship them with slow shipping. You got to ship them overnight or 2-day shipping. And so that's pretty expensive to do and stuff like that. So it's not cheap. And also, for some pests, the biological control agents are not commercially available. Think of emerald ash borer, which I know has gone through your part of the state, wiped out pretty much any susceptible ash tree. There are some introduced parasitic wasps that can help kill emerald ash borer, not the sort of thing that you and I can purchase. They are reared in a government facility and released, so that's more of a coordinated governmental effort. So that's the direct route, though. And again, it's applicable in some cases in our yards and landscapes, not as much. In certain other scenarios, though, it's picking up steam. For example, greenhouse settings. And if you think of a greenhouse, you've got very consistent conditions. You can control temperature. You can control humidity to a certain extent. You can control sometimes the amount of light, the photo period with lights and things like that. So you can have very consistent conditions. Also, it's enclosed. So if you introduce predatory insects, they can't really fly away and leave. You can contain them in there. So we are seeing more of that direct route in certain scenarios like greenhouse settings. Otherwise, we've got the indirect route, what I kind of call the field of dreams route. Basically, if you build it, they will come. If you build or design your landscape to make it attractive to beneficial insects, you can draw them into an area. So we're doing that kind of indirectly. We put out what the beneficial insects want, draw them into the area, and then because of that, they're here. So we'll talk about more of those details. So as I said, we've got that direct route, directly increasing the numbers of predators or parasitic insects. There are some that are commercially available. Sometimes the results can vary with these because if you release 1,000 adult lady beetles and 998 of them fly away, well, there goes your $100 or whatever that you just spent versus in a greenhouse where you got more controlled conditions. One cool example, though, and this is relevant to Wisconsin, we are the dairy state after all. June, I think, is dairy month, if I remember correctly. If you are on a dairy farm, you have cows, you have manure. That's a fact of life. If you have manure, you're going to have flies. That's another fact of life. So farmers have to manage their manure for a number of reasons. But if you have a bunch of flies around, you got to do something about it because some of those flies can be biting flies and harass your cows, and then they're not producing as much milk. So often on a farm, that means a lot of spraying, or you have to take the manure far away and do something to it. So you're not rearing a bunch of flies. Sometimes there's a lot of insecticides used. Another option that is sometimes used, and I have heard some good, encouraging results from this, you can buy parasitic tiny stingless wasps that specifically attack these flies. So in that bottom right-hand picture, what you see is that brownish pod-like structure. That is the puparium or pupal stage of a housefly. And then you see that little black ant-like creature. That's a stingless parasitic wasp that will inject her eggs into the pupa. Her egg is going to hatch. The wasp larva is going to consume that fly from the inside, kill it, complete its development, and then emerge as an adult wasp and go about its business. So these things, you don't introduce them and they just perpetually are there. You often have to introduce them several times throughout the year. But I've chatted with folks on horse farms, for example, that have used these with good results. They have not had to spray as much insecticide because these beneficial parasitic wasps are helping take care of the fly problem for them. So that's one example of a commercially available biocontrol agent and that kind of direct route. Otherwise, we've got this indirect route, and there's research backing this up. So in general, the short message is the more plant diversity you have around you, that's going to draw in and attract a greater diversity of beneficial insects, things like pollinators, things like predators, things like parasites. The predators and parasites, they basically need to go to flowers as a nectar fuel source. Think of it this way. They're running a marathon. They're out there going about their business. They need some Gatorade to drink. And for an insect, that is nectar from flowers. And so if you have a scenario like we have on the left, and this happens in Wisconsin and the Midwest as a whole, you've got nothing but agricultural fields, essentially. Corn, 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 a monoculture crop. Maybe you have some, roadways between them, treated with herbicides or something like that. Relatively low plant diversity on that scenario on the left versus on the right, if we have a landscape that is more of a patchwork of different crops, some annual crops, some perennial crops, and so on, you can add conservation strips of prairie flowers or wildflowers or something like that. We know from research studies in that scenario on the right, you're going to have a lot more and greater diversity of beneficial predators and parasitic insects around. So that will be helping you out. And so again, this is the indirect route. We are not directly introducing these insects. We are designing the landscape so it's more conducive and more encouraging for them, and they're showing up on their own accord. So kind of that field of dreams route, as I said. We can translate that from the realm of agriculture to our yards and gardens, essentially. If we have a yard on the left that looks like this, and I've got kids, I can appreciate that to a certain point. You've got a play structure, you've got a very nice lawn there for kicking a soccer ball or playing football or you name it, but not much plant diversity. That might be one single turf species, maybe a few weeds in it here and there, but I really don't see weeds in that lawn. It's probably treated with an herbicide. So very low diversity in that situation. I wouldn't expect to find a terribly wide, diverse group of insects if we went out and thoroughly surveyed, versus the situation on the right. We have a vegetable garden, but there's also diversity of crops there. There's a diversity of flowering plants around. And so if we were to survey two yards that look like the left and right, on the right, almost certainly we're going to find a greater diversity of predatory and parasitic insects that would be helping us out control pests that may be around. So let's go on a survey of some of these beneficial insects. Many of these you've maybe seen or heard of and just didn't recognize what they were. So I want to take you on a survey of many of these. There's a couple I'm going to mention on this slide, but I'm not going to get into the details today just because of time constraints. But when I think about beneficial biocontrols, we're talking about predators, we're talking about parasites or really parasitoids. I'll define what a parasitoid is when we get to that. And then also pathogens, which I'm not really going to talk about for time, but I mentioned this earlier. There are entomopathogenic or insect infecting bacteria, fungi and viruses out there that under the right conditions can pop up and help take care of problems for us. In some situations, those pathogens can be produced, mass produced in laboratory controlled settings to basically make what we would call like a biopesticide. You can formulate and spray on an entomopathogenic fungus under the right conditions to help control pests, for example. So let's dive into the survey. And before I do that, I always like to share with folks some of my favorite resources so that if you want to learn more on this topic, I like to highlight maybe a book or two to help you do this. This is one of my all-time probably top five insect books out there. This is Garden Insects of North America. This photograph here happens to be the first edition by Whitney Cranshaw. It's been out for probably 15 or so years. There is a newer second edition that I think came out about 5 or 7-ish years ago by Whitney Cranshaw, and I think Dave Shetler is a second author on it. It's an updated version. Either edition is a really good resource. I should also say this book, it's called Garden Insects of North America. In my mind, it really should be Garden and Yard Insects of North America. So don't let the term garden skew you and think it's just veggie gardens or something like that. This covers landscape pests too. So it does a great job of really illustrating some of the common pests you'll see out there. And it's hundreds of pages long and really densely packed with color photos, but there's a great and sizable chapter on beneficial insects. So if you just want some reference photos to realize, oh yeah, those are good things and you can keep on your shelf, that would be this particular book. So it's loaded with images. I think it retails for about 30-ish bucks. The first edition you could probably pick up used for maybe 10, 15 bucks potentially. I occasionally see it in used bookstores. The second edition, again, probably retails for about 30, 35 because it's a little bit newer, but all in all, a great resource to learn about garden and yard pests, but also those beneficial creatures as well. So let's dive into some of the beetles. So it turns out beetles are actually the single most diverse group of animals on the planet, period. If we were to list all the animal species known to science, I think it's somewhere in the range of like 1.6 million or something like that. Well over a million animal species described. The vast majority of those are insects, like 80-ish%. And if you split it out further, there's so many beetles. There's about 450,000 beetle species that are known to science. And so if we were to look at a gigantic pie chart, about one out of every four animals, numerically speaking, is a beetle of one kind or another. So that's, I mean, it's mind-boggling when you think about it. There are beetle families that have more species than there are species of vertebrates or creatures with backbones that we know of. So it's kind of mind-boggling. With that said, amazing diversity. Of course, there's going to be some pests like Japanese beetle, but lots of beneficials in this group too. There are beetles that can be pollinators, beetles that can be, in rare cases, parasites, but there are plenty of predatory beetles that I want to focus on. So first things first, if you look on the ground this time of the year, especially after dark, and you see just an ovalish beetle running around on your driveway or sidewalk or on your back patio blocks, bricks, it's almost certainly a member of the family Carabidae, which we commonly call the ground beetles. There are some that are pretty small, maybe a quarter of an inch long. Some are even smaller than that. There's some large species too, like in the upper left corner, there's that metallic green one called the fiery searcher. That one will actually feed on caterpillars up in trees, like invasive spongy moth, and it'll wander down from one tree trunk all the way to the ground and then go to a neighboring tree and climb back up into the canopy. So they're making these pretty big, significant journeys to go and feed on pests for us. And there's some really cool looking ones. That's a kind of a prize group by researchers and collectors. Their skinnier cousins are the rove beetles. A lot of rove beetles are pretty small. There are some larger species out there. But if you all remember the movie from like the 90s, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, when they shrink the kids down from the science experiment and they befriend an ant in that movie. I mean, the ant I remember as a kid because I grew up in that era when that movie came out. I remember the ant being kind of scary, but gosh, if I bumped into a rove beetle like the bottom right corner, that would be a scary beast to see. I mean, look at the mandibles or mouth parts on it. Those can be excellent predators. And then the larvae shown on the bottom left corner also excellent predators as well. And these can often be common in soil, under the bark of rotting logs and things like that. And then one other common one, which we all see this time of the year, at least the adults, fireflies. The adult fireflies usually aren't doing a whole lot of feeding. Some species technically can. But what folks often don't realize or recognize are the larvae of fireflies, which are beneficial predators of mollusks like slugs. And so, if you have good conditions for slugs, you probably also have good conditions for fireflies. In larval or juvenile fireflies are these kind of armor-plated looking things. They're usually blackish with pink on the body, which we can see in that upper right-hand photo, and it's actually feeding on a slug in that photo. So, if I am digging out in garden soil, it's not uncommon to bump into these. If I am scraping up, digging in mulch beds, stuff like that, I will very commonly bump into these as well. So those are some really good insects to have around. Lady beetles, the family Coccinellidae, are beneficial for the most part. There's technically a few lady beetles that are plant feeders. One example here in the state is called the Mexican bean beetle, can damage garden beans and soybeans. Not very commonly, though. I maybe see a case or two a year, but we've got lots of other species that are predatory. Now, a lot of these are native. There are some non-native ones, including the multicolored Asian lady beetle, Harmonia axaritis. That's the one that likes to get into your homes in the fall. We're maybe not happy about it when they're coming indoors, but if you're, say, a gardener or a farmer and you have these in your crop fields this time of the year, that's a good thing for you because the adults are beneficial predators. They'll feed on small caterpillars, aphids, and things like that. The larvae, shown in the bottom right-hand corner, are also excellent predators and will feed on small, soft-bodied insects like aphids. And then one other thing, you can learn to recognize both the eggs and the pupal stage fairly easily. So the eggs of most lady beetles look like miniature yellow footballs. They actually have kind of a egg or football-like shape, but you'll see them laid in clusters of maybe 5, 10, 20 or so. That's what we see in the bottom left-hand corner photo. So if I'm looking at a plant in my yard or garden and I say, gosh, there's some aphids here, but I'm seeing a lot of little yellow eggs. That's my signal to me. Lady beetles are starting to show up. I'm maybe going to wait and watch a week or so and see how things shake out. Because if I'm seeing a lot of lady beetle eggs, soon I'm going to have larvae, like in the bottom right-hand picture. Eventually, when those larvae reach maturity and they're ready to pupate, they're going to look like that photo in the upper right-hand corner. They basically attach themselves by kind of their butt or posterior end, and they may flop around a little bit, but it's the pupal stage. They're not feeding at that point. They're just kind of hanging out there, flopping around a little bit. But if you see those pupae, it means that very soon you'll have the adult lady beetles. So lady beetles are an example of a predatory beneficial beetle. Moving on to another group, the true bugs. This is the order Hemiptera. These are insects with sucking mouth parts, and they go through simple or gradual metamorphosis. And some of these are really fairly common. We've all probably heard of assassin bugs, like in the bottom left-hand corner. And there's a whole bunch of species around. Some are orangish. A lot of the common ones I see are actually a neon greenish color, very, very vibrant, and those can be decent sized. There's also damsel bugs in the upper right-hand corner. Those can be pretty common. They're maybe a quarter of an inch long and pretty much always a beige color. I will often see those hanging out on flowers. And then there's a couple that are common, but they're rather small, like big-eyed bugs, Geochoridae in the bottom right-hand corner. And then a very common one in the upper left-hand corner would be minute pirate bugs, which are black and whitish. They kind of have this triangular pattern. There's little whitish triangular areas on those the wings on their body. I will say though, those minute pirate bugs, especially in late summer, if the conditions are right and they're abundant in your area, they can land on you and bite. We are not a food source for them. That's just kind of incidental, accidental kind of tasting, but it'll really get your attention. So they are generalist predators that'll feed on pretty much any small insect, but they could be, not your favorite insect if you happen to be bitten by them. Those are actually sold commercially for use in like greenhouse settings because they can be such good predators for small insects like thrips, for example. When it comes to stink bugs, the family Pentatomidae, about two-thirds of our species are herbivores, plant feeders. A lot of those are minor pests. Some of them, like brown marmorated stink bug, can be notable crop pests, but also brown marmorated stink bug can invade our homes in the fall, and we're probably not happy about that. But for that family, about a third of the species in the subfamily Asopinae are beneficial predatory stink bugs. And so they can really help us out. I actually was wandering across the UW campus yesterday going through a wooded area and happened to see one of these in action feeding on caterpillars. So you can see that insect on the left-hand photograph. It's using its long tubular mouth part, those piercing sucking mouth parts. And in that case, it's piercing a caterpillar, which is actually longer than it. So these things can take down some sizable prey. And imagine they've got that tubular straw for a mouth part. They cannot chew on things if they want to. They are restricted to a liquid diet. So often, what these things do, in a nutshell, is they attack their prey. They inject some sort of enzymes to start liquefying dinner for them, so to speak, to make kind of a protein smoothie to slurp up. But then they're drinking up their prey. So pretty impressive what they can do. There's a spine soldier bug, which can be fairly common. There's also one called the two-spotted stink bug. And if you grow potatoes and have Colorado potato beetle around, this is a good one to have. And the very upper right-hand corner, those would be the juveniles, a little bit harder to recognize because there's other species that look like that, but the adults below that, black with a little bit of red, very distinctive appearance. So if you're seeing those around, that's a good sign because they love to feed on Colorado potato beetle larvae, for example. There are some flies that are predators, and flies as a whole often get kind of a bad rap. People think of flies, they think of like house flies or biting flies, and they probably have a negative impression of the group. And, for good reason, for some of those species can really be some bad apples in the bunch, so to speak. But there are lots of flies that are excellent pollinators. And in some parts of the planet, flies can be better pollinators than bees, even. But there's a lot of predatory flies. So there's a family Syrphidae, the hover flies or flower flies, as they're sometimes called. You've all probably seen the adults, which can be good pollinators. That's what we see in the upper left-hand photo. They're often mistaken for bees because of the coloration on the body, black and yellow stripes, essentially. The adults aren't really feeding or attacking other insects. They're sipping nectar and doing some pollination. But for many species, the larvae are good predators. Now, most fly larvae, which we technically call maggots, they don't want to be out in the open. If you're crawling around on a leaf surface, a bird might get you or something else might pick you off. But for some of these predatory hoverflies, the larvae will just patrol around kind of out in the open and attack things like aphids. So if you ever look on a plant and you see aphids around and you see a pale green or pale yellowish or sometimes even pinkish maggot looking thing wandering around, that's probably one of these predatory hoverfly larvae, and they're helping you out. And I have seen cases where these have popped up in pretty good density, and they will just go from aphid to aphid to aphid, munching on them. There's also some flies that can be really large. The family Acylidae or the robber flies are these big, kind of shaggy or hairy looking flies in a lot of cases. And their behavior is kind of analogous to dragonflies. They are aerial acrobats. They're very agile in flight. They have great vision. I mean, here's a creature that's flying through three-dimensional space and it's catching another moving insect. You have to have good eyesight to be able to do that and be very maneuverable. So, in that bottom left-hand picture, you actually see a robber fly that is captured and is feeding on one of those beneficial hoverfly adults. So it's not clear-cut teams of good guys and bad guys. It's again, it's a lot of gray zone area out there. Uh, on the other hand, on the bottom right-hand picture, you have a large robber fly that's over an inch long, and it has captured and is feeding on a Japanese beetle. And these robber flies actually have venom that they can use to subdue their prey. If you're familiar with the term from psychology, Schadenfreude, that picture on the bottom right, the robber fly attacking the Japanese beetle, that's kind of my definition of Schadenfreude right there. Mantids, praying mantids, which we really don't have native to Wisconsin. We do have two non-native species that pop up, and over time I'm seeing these a little bit more. In general, praying mantids are much more common to the south and east of us, where we have milder winters. So if you went to, say, Kentucky, for example, they're going to be a lot more common than up here. However, the last two winters have been relatively mild. We had that very mild El Nino winter. This last winter wasn't terribly mild either. So I do get quite a few mantid reports, especially from the southern two tiers or rows of counties in Wisconsin. Then also where you all are located, going up the coast, maybe towards Door County, because Lake Michigan acts as a temperature buffer and kind of buffers some of the extreme cold temperatures in the winter months. So if you do happen to see these, in my mind, they're mostly kind of a curiosity because not native here, but uh, I often get the question, are they bad for the environment? They don't really seem to be out competing any of our native insects, as far as I can tell. So, in my mind, they're just kind of a cool insect to come across. They're fun to watch. It's a great kind of a teachable moment or learning opportunity. If you happen to see one of these, kids love them, adults love them, and they're beneficial predators. So they're just kind of fun to watch. We've got the Chinese mantis, which of the mantids I see in Wisconsin, probably 90% are that species. And then there's technically a European mantis as well. You can keep an eye out for the egg cases, or Uatheca, as we technically call them, of mantids. They're these large brownish pods, maybe about an inch or so long. These will be on very exposed locations, twigs, branches, garden stakes, things like that. They make it through the winter months as long as it's not too cold. And then out of that, you could easily hatch 100, 150 young mantids. Most of those will not survive. There's cannibalism, get attacked by other things. They die for this reason or that. But often those will go through the winter. You'll get hatching about this time of the year, and then we tend to see our adult mantids in about August and September, especially in southeastern Wisconsin. Moving on to one of my favorite groups of insects, the order Neuroptera, which if you look at kind of the scientific meaning behind it, literally means nerve wings. Because if you look at the wings of the adults in that upper left-hand photo, it has this very delicate nerve-like pattern of veins in the wings. And we've all seen lace wings coming to porch lights, deck lights at night. We have a family Chrysopode, which are the green lacewings, have that vibrant neon green color, and they can be decent size, half inch, three-quarters of an inch long. Some might be close to an inch longer. So relatively large eyes. They are predators. They've got decent eyesight to be able to see their prey. So the adults are beneficial predators. But then the larvae are fierce predators. We can see in that upper right-hand photo that lacewing larva has actually impaled a caterpillar, which is larger than itself. So these things can, relatively speaking, take down some large prey items like caterpillars. They're also very, very fond of attacking and consuming aphids, though. And if you want to see kind of some cool video clips, go onto YouTube and search for lacewing eating aphids, and you'll be able to find some videos where this lacewing larva takes its mandibles, the kind of pokey mouth parts, and it's going to take those and impale an aphid. Now, these mandibles or mouth parts are actually hollow. So, what they do is they impale their prey. They often will lift it up and then they suck the guts out of the thing. And so, if you watch these videos, the aphid that's being eaten just ends up kind of shriveling up like a pop balloon, and then it'll toss it to the side, walk right down to the next aphid who's just standing there. And it'll go down the line and munch on aphid after aphid. So, I can't tell you how many times I have seen these kind of act as the cavalry that comes in and really starts knocking down an aphid population. So really good predators, very common on plants. I will say though, I will sometimes see lacewing larvae just wandering in odd spots, like on my canvas grill cover and stuff like that. Probably tumbled out of a tree from above, but they pop up in some unusual locations at time. Now, most insect eggs are hard to identify. There's just not good identification resources for them. There's not a whole lot of features to look at. We talked about lady beetle eggs, those mini clusters of mini yellow footballs, mantid egg cases, which are kind of brownish styrofoam-like, about an inch long. And then some of the lacewing eggs can actually be pretty easy to identify. They're these little white eggs, but they are raised up or suspended by a thin, translucent stalk. And there's really two reasons I can think of for that. The first is that it offers protection from other insects. If you're an insect egg just sitting down on the surface of a leaf, something could be an ant, another predatory insect comes along and eats you before you even hatch. And that's the end of your story. With lacewings being such fierce predators, this also protects them from each other. So the first lacewing to hatch out of that batch of eggs is going to slide down that stalk and then have to wander off to look for food. If all the eggs were down at the same level, the first one to hatch out might end up eating a lot of its siblings, which is not a great evolutionary strategy if you start eating all of your other litter mates, so to speak. So it can offer a little bit of protection, but once you know what these eggs look like, little whitish egg raised up by a thin translucent stalk. Sometimes you'll see individual eggs, sometimes you'll see clusters of eggs like that bottom left-hand photo. That's a good sign. It means that very soon you're going to have lacewing larvae. So again, that's something else I would train your eye to look for. If you're looking on plants, you see aphids, keep an eye out for those lacewing eggs as well, because they are excellent predators, some of my very favorites. And in some cases, these are commercially available for use in yards or gardens, or especially in greenhouse settings where you can control those conditions. Then there are wasps, plenty of wasps that are predators, particularly our social wasps, but some of our solitary wasps as well. And I mentioned these earlier because this is an example where context is so very, very important. You know, if you've got that paper mache nest in the bottom left-hand photo, and that's right outside your front door, you know, if it's my house, I'm going to be doing something about that because I've got kids. I don't want to get stung by them. Don't want my dog being stung. But if that nest were way in the back corner of my yard and it's way up in a tree, they're probably helping me out, and my sting risk is going to be pretty darn low in a case like that. So context is very, very important in these cases. But our social wasps, like the bald-faced hornet, which is technically a type of yellow jacket, our run-of-the-mill yellow jackets and paper wasps as well, they are all great predators. They also can be pollinators technically too. But when you have these social nests, the queen is in the nest. She is raising a workforce of young. She's got all these workers. Her larvae that are in the nest, they need protein as a food source to be fed to them by the workers that go out hunting for caterpillars and sawfly larvae and things like that. So those adult wasps are hunting for these other insects. They bring it in as a protein source, and then they're feeding it to the developing young. So they have enough protein to build their bodies essentially. Those same adult wasps are also going to flowers for nectar, carbohydrates. That's what they need as a Gatorade fuel source to power them through the day. So these things can be excellent predators. And to a certain point, they can almost be too good of predators in certain situations. For example, if you were doing butterfly gardening, where you're putting out specific plants to attract specific butterflies to lay eggs, you get caterpillars to get more of those butterflies, and you happen to have a nest of these around, and they find those caterpillars, they can come in and, you know, in a short period of time, pick those off. So if you ever have a caterpillar or batch of caterpillars you've seen on plants, they're there one day and just gone the next, it's possible social wasps or another predatory insect might have found them. Then we've got things that aren't insects but are closely related. There are some mites that are predators. There are mites that can be pests too, like spider mites, but there's predatory mites out there, including some that are commercially available for use in like greenhouse settings. And then spiders in general. If you have spiders in your yard, in your garden, in your house, for the most part, they're really quite harmless to you and unlikely to bite. They often get blamed as kind of nature's scapegoats, but really they're beneficial creatures. They are there to feed on insects. They're really helping you out in that regard. So moving on from predators to parasites are really what we call parasitoids. So to separate the two, a good parasite does not kill its host. If I have a tapeworm parasite and the tapeworm kills me, well, that's the end of the line for the tapeworm too. So a parasite doesn't want to kill its host. It just wants to siphon off some energy from it. In contrast, a parasitoid is a parasite that does specifically kill its host. So in a lot of cases, these are specialists. They might go to a particular species or maybe a group of related species that they go to. They can either be ecto, meaning on the outside of, or endoparasites or parasitoids. In a lot of cases, they're going to be, for the most part, smaller than their prey. And it's going to sound like science fiction, but actually, science fiction movies have stolen this concept from the world of entomology. So, if you all remember the original Aliens movie with Sigourney Weaver, when they're sitting around that table and the alien bursts out of the guy, that's basically what these parasitoids do. So, in that right-hand picture, what you're seeing, that beige object, that's a parasitized aphid. The black creature, that's a wasp that completed its development and is chewing its way out. And so there are wasps that are parasitoids, and there are some flies that are parasitoids. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail, especially the wasps. If you were to look at the Hymenoptera, or the group of insects that are the ants, bees, wasps, and related creatures like sawflies, there's actually an amazing diversity within that family tree that are these parasitoid species. So there's a crazy diversity of these things out there. Again, they're often kind of lock and key model. You'll have one species of wasp that specifically attacks one species of insect or so on. A lot of these are microscopic to a certain extent. We're talking about wasps that are maybe 2 millimeters long. We would call that a parasitoid. You could then have a wasp called a hyperparasitoid that specifically makes its living attacking the parasitoid. Then you could have a hyperparasitoid that attacks the hyperparasitoid. So the smallest known insects out there are truly microscopic, and they belong to this group. They're these stingless parasitoid wasps. Some of them are a little bit bigger. A good example of that, the upper left-hand photo, that's a female pelicinid wasp. She's about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches long. Looks like she could give you a nasty sting, but she cannot sting. What she does is she takes that long tail and probes down into the soil to find a May June beetle. That's what she specifically attacks, and then her larva hangs on the outside of it like a giant leech sucking energy from it. That's what we see in that drawing in the bottom left-hand corner. Lots of these are very small though. So if you were to look at that photograph on the right, that's a hornworm caterpillar, which you might find on your tomatoes or peppers. It has been parasitized by dozens, if not hundreds, of tiny braconid wasps. And what these wasps do, they're really good. They will be feeding internally, and they know which tissues to feed on. They feed on the less critical tissues. They don't go for the heart or the brain because that keeps their host alive and fresh. No, they feed on the other less critical tissues, keeping their host alive. And then when they're ready to pupate, they move to the outside of the caterpillar. They spin these little white silken cocoons. That hornworm caterpillar is a goner at this point, and occasionally folks will see this in their own gardens. If you see that, that's evidence of parasitism by these microscopic parasitoid wasps. There's a whole bunch of these that go after aphids. So that's what we see in the larger picture on the left. You've got that greenish aphid. You've got a tiny wasp right there. So that female, again, is going to inject her egg inside of it. It's going to hatch, consume the aphid from the inside, kill it, and then emerge as a new adult wasp. Now, when aphids get parasitized by these wasps, they tend to take on this plump beige appearance, and they'll retain that shape even when the wasp is gone. And we actually call those parasitized aphids mummies. That's a technical term for them. And I've seen plants where I'll look, yes, there's aphids present, but 80–90% of the aphids are showing evidence of parasitism. They are mummies. So in this case, in that bottom right-hand photo, you can see there is an aphid that has this dark hole at the back end. That means that developing wasp is left. If there's no hole, that means the developing wasp is still inside, completing its development. There are flies that do this. There's some really cool obscure flies out there, like the wave-winged flies family Pergodidae, which specifically attack May June beetles. But the commonest example would be tachinid flies. There's an entire family, the family Tachinidae. And what they tend to do is they'll lay one or two or three whitish eggs, basically in the neck region, and like just behind the head of the insect they're going to attack. And then it's a race. Usually the first egg that hatches out, the larva is going to burrow into the host and claim it as theirs. It's like, who can, be king of the hill the fastest? They burrow inside, they're going to kill that host insect and complete their development. So it's a heck of a way to go for the host insect, but this can really be quite beneficial to help control certain pests sometimes. Then let's talk a little bit about decomposers, because as I said, a lot of times folks don't realize these are even out there going about their business, really helping us out. If we didn't have insect decomposers, all the fallen leaves that come down wouldn't get broken down. They would accumulate over time. But instead, we've got insects, we've got earthworms and things like that that feed on them. If you have livestock or animals, you're going to have dung or waste. There's our dung beetles that feed on them. We have plenty of species in the state. What most folks don't realize is that our dung beetles are about maybe a quarter of an inch long or so. And so very easily overlooked. I've also been out hiking at parks where there's horse trails. You have fresh droppings from a horse. And I've seen some of these dung beetles land within minutes and they basically burrow in and you wouldn't see them. It's like you blink and you would have missed them. And unless you're digging through that cow pie or horse horse dung, you wouldn't realize these things are there. But they are helping feed on and break down that material. They'll lay eggs and their young develop in that stuff. When we have dead animal remains, something's got to feed on that and break it down, all that roadkill on our roads and stuff like that. There's a whole group of insects that do that. There's things like the American carrion beetle on the left. There's a whole bunch of different species of what we call sexton or burying beetles, the genus Necrophorus. They're large, about an inch plus long, black with reddish usually, and they help break down and feed on animal remains. One of the first things to show up at animal remains would be blowflies. You've all seen the adult blowflies. They're these metallic green or metallic blue flies, but their larvae or maggots feed on and break down animal remains. And if you've ever watched a show like CSI and there's a forensic entomologist, they're really looking at those blowfly larvae because they know it takes such a length of time at a certain temperature to reach the next growth stage. And so you can actually use those insects for forensic investigation. The adult blowflies, they'll show up, lay eggs, but they actually go to flowers and can be good pollinators in cases like that. When we're talking about decomposing plant matter, there's things like millipedes, there's things like pill bugs, springtails. Those three are not insects, but are closely related, play very important roles. And then things like cockroaches generally get a bad rap. There's over 3,000 cockroach species on the planet. There's probably about 25 or 30 that kind of give the rest of them a bad rap. Most roach species on the planet, the overwhelming majority of them are beneficial. They could not survive in your house if they wanted to, and they're playing a role out in the ecosystem breaking things down. For example, in Wisconsin, we have our native wood roaches in the genus Parkablata. If you go to like the driftless area or a wooded area and you were to kick open rotting stumps, rotting logs, you can find these cockroaches living in those environments. And again, it's not the type of roach that could survive in your house if it wanted to. It's not humid and damp enough, yet these things are playing a role out in nature and can be very beneficial in that regard. And then anytime you think of a wooded area, you got whole bunch of trees. Some are young, some are old, some are dead, some are dying, and so on. And there's a whole array of insects that play a role in breaking them down. Some insects attack trees that are maybe dying and kind of on their way out the door. But when you have dead trees standing or logs on the ground, you have all sorts of insects that tunnel in there. And once these kind of initial species get in and they create tunnels, there's other insects that maybe aren't great diggers or tunnelers, but they can use pre-existing tunnels to get in and then complete their development. And there's essentially an entire ecosystem in a log. So there's all these insects playing a role in the breakdown of these plant and animal remains. And then let's wrap up by talking about pollinators. Again, this is another critical ecosystem service, a benefit provided to us by Mother Nature, essentially. And when I say pollinator, folks first and foremost probably think of honeybees or maybe bumblebees, but we have about 500 species of bees in Wisconsin. Honeybee is one species, and it's not native to Wisconsin or North America. It was brought over by Europeans. We've got about 24 species of bumblebees in the state. That means that we have roughly 475 or so other species of bees. Then when you think of pollinators, really any organism that is moving pollen from one flower to another can be a pollinator. So that can be bees. Many bees are excellent pollinators. Some bees, not so much. They actually parasitize other bees. There are plenty of wasps that can be great pollinators. There are flies and beetles, butterflies and moths can be good pollinators too. In some situations, you and I could be pollinators. There's actually a really interesting study I saw from a village in China where they had used so many insecticides, it basically wiped out their local pollinators insect-wise. And so humans have to go into the orchards and pollinate the fruit trees so that they can get fruit to be able to grow and sell to people. So humans can be pollinators technically. But bees get a lot of attention and for good reason. Again, we've got hundreds of species of wild solitary bees out there. This means they live alone. They don't have a big nest or colony like honeybees or bumblebees. These are things like sweat bees, which you've probably all heard of. There's leafcutter bees, which specifically cut out with their mouth parts, just like a pair of scissors. They'll cut out this circular, semicircular notch from the edges of leaves. They take that disc of leaf material back and shove it in a little tube that they nest in. A lot of our solitary bees nest in the ground, and their nests look like anthills. It's a small mound of soil. There's like one bee that lives in there, and they are very, very docile because they don't have that big colony of relatives to defend. So, this photograph in the bottom right-hand corner, that's something called a cellophane bee. I've lied down on a park lawn where there's hundreds or thousands of these nests around, and they're probably just wondering, what's this guy doing here? But they don't bother me at all. They don't come out or sting or anything like that. These wild bees tend to be very, very docile creatures, unlikely to sting. You'd probably have to catch them barehanded before they'd actually sting you. If you grow pumpkins, squash, or so on, there's the squash bee, which evolved specifically with cucurbit crops, is an excellent pollinator of those crops. They're so good and so specialized that they will nest in the soil right next to that same plant. And they may go a foot or more down, but they'll hang out just in that very area. And so they are really, really good at pollinating those crops. As I said, any creature going to flowers can do pollination. So we talked about those social wasps earlier, paper wasps, yellow jackets, and so on. In that upper right-hand corner, look how hairy that thorax is on that wasp. There's a lot of pollen grains stuck to it. So if it goes from that flower to another goldenrod flower, it's going to be moving some pollen around. There are beetles that are pollinators. Actually, beetles are probably evolutionarily speaking probably some of the very first pollinators out there, hundreds of million years ago. There are flies that are excellent pollinators in some parts of the planet, like high elevations up in the mountains or high Arctic areas, colder areas of the globe. Flies are probably much more important than bees because they can tolerate those conditions better for the species there. And then moths and butterflies can be great pollinators as well. We're actually learning more and more about the importance of moths, and in many cases, they can perhaps be as good of pollinators as bees. It's just they're doing it after dark. And so you and I are inside asleep and we don't see the work that they're doing. Now, if you want to learn more about bees, there's a couple of really good resources out there. One is a Wisconsin bee identification guide that I've got on my website, or if you Google that, you'll be able to find it. It talks about a dozen or so of the commonest bees in Wisconsin. Otherwise, if you want to really get to know the bees in your backyard, there's literally a book called The Bees in Your Backyard by Joe Wilson and Olivia Carroll. It's a great book. It's one that I use as an entomologist. It does contain some technical information that I can use for diagnostic purposes, but I feel it's also written in a way that is really good just for the general public that is curious to know more about these fascinating creatures. So that's a really good book. Loaded with photographs, and it's not terribly expensive either. And it'll give you a great overview of the main groups of bees across North America. As I said, in Wisconsin, about 500 species of bees. In the US as a whole, we probably have about 3,500 to 4,000 species or so. And just to wrap up, a little bit more about bees. We hear about bee declines and things like that in the news. What do bees need to survive? Not all that different than us. They need food and shelter, really. Food and, well, some water too. But a lot of cases are getting their moisture from nectar from flowers. They're getting pollen as a protein source, and then shelter. About two-thirds of all our bee species are ground nesters, meaning they have a tiny nest in the ground. When someone calls me in August and says, I was mowing my lawn, I got stung by angry ground bees, well, the only thing that lives together as a colony in the ground that's a bee is going to be like a bumblebee that might sting you. And most folks recognize bumblebees right away. In a lot of cases, folks have run over the nest of ground nesting yellow jackets, and that's really what's stinging them, but they're blaming the bees. When I think of ground bees, I think of lone individual bees that basically live in a little anthill. And as I said, they're extremely docile creatures. Then we've got about a third of our bees that are tube nesters. They will go to hollow plant stems, or if you have a standing tree or a log and another insect has tunneled into it, in that empty tunnel, these insects will make their nest. And then we've got cavity nesters like bumblebees. If there were a feral honeybee colony, they might get into a hollow tree or something like that. Bumblebees like to nest in pre-existing like old chipmunk burrows and stuff like that in the ground. And just a couple of things briefly, how you can help out pollinators. We're talking things generally like minimizing and reducing pesticide use in your yard, or making sure you really have a good reason to use a pesticide, because that is probably playing a role in pollinator and insect declines. Also, we talked about kind of that indirect approach of attracting beneficial predators and parasites. Same kind of thing applies to pollinators. Make your yard and landscape pollinator friendly by increasing overall plant diversity. That's one of the best things you can do. If you want to do like one thing to increase or help out, maximize ways you can help out insects in your yard, it's going to be diversify plants, in my mind. Providing nesting habitat, sometimes leaving up hollow plant stems for solitary bees, maybe putting up a bee house or bee hotel. If you can do that correctly, that could be a good thing to do. And also just educate yourself. Teach others about these insects and ways that they can help them as well. As I said, one of the single best things you can do is to diversify your yard. Um, if ideally you can have three or more different types of plants from different plant families blooming at any point in time, that's awesome. Also, think about the temporal aspect, the blooming times. If we have 20 things that bloom in the month of June, that's great. But if we have nothing that blooms in August or September, we basically close the buffet for insects. So have a diversity of plants, diversity of blooming times, different shapes, sizes, structures of flowers, because each pollinator can have slightly different preferences. I like to go with native plants because many of our native insects have simply evolved with those plants. I'm not saying that non-native plants are useless by any means. I mean, there's plenty of plants you can pick up from the garden center that are various varieties and cultivars and stuff like that that pollinators will go to in my own yard. My wife loves zinnias, and so she puts in a lot of zinnias, and we see insects go into that. But again, some of our native insects evolved and are probably best suited for some of our native plants too. And also, if you're looking at those really flashy flowers, those double flowers, they have spectacular blooms, but sometimes those blooms have really been bred to be catchy to the human eye, and they might offer little to no pollen or nectar. So keep that in mind. One other thing you consider is simply tolerating some of those weedy flowering plants. I have some colleagues that researched in urban, suburban lawns in Lexington, Kentucky area, things like dandelions and clover, and they found over 50 different insects going to those particular plants. So what we may call a weed could be breakfast, lunch, and dinner for some of the pollinators around us. And with that said, I'm going to wrap up my survey of beneficial insects. I hope you all enjoyed this and appreciated and learned something new. And with that said, I'll turn it back over for a couple of minutes to answer some questions from the group.
Great. Thank you so much, PJ. Very,
Sure.
very interesting. And there are a couple questions in the chat here. One person was interested in the diversity of insects in land, and was wondering if the practice of crop rotation does increase the diversity or support, enough of a diverse population of insect predators.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would have to dig into the literature on that. I mean, the main reason that I think of crop rotation is more from a pest management practice. There are both certain insects and sometimes plant diseases where if you keep growing the same crop in the same location again and again and again, it's going to come back to, kick you at some point. Maybe the disease or the pest just build up to such high levels that it's causing major losses for your crops. And so crop rotation is often done to help kind of move around. Just as an example, we have an insect called the corn rootworm. That's our number one pest of corn. Our corn farmers have to use more insecticide for that insect than pretty much all the other ones out there. And with corn rootworm, it lays eggs in the fields where the corn is grown. And so those eggs sit there through the winter, then the larvae feed in spring. And if you plant corn there again, that's exactly what they want. But if you rotate to say something like soybeans, those larvae will hatch. They have nothing to feed on because they can only feed on corn. And so that's why crop rotation can sometimes be a very, very powerful and chemical-free management approach. So that's my main thought behind the reasoning for crop rotation. In regard to the question about diversity, again, it's a really good question, and I just don't know off the top of my head how much that would work to support beneficials. Also, I mean, my hunch is that you'd probably get more bang for your buck rather than rotation, incorporating additional plant diversity into the landscape, be it in your own yard or in agro ecosystems. So that might mean planting conservation strips of prairie flowers or wildflowers or something like that. I suspect that might help you out more from the diversity aspect of predators and parasites rather than crop rotation.
Is there a way to get rid of carpenter bees?
Yeah, so carpenter bees are interesting. So they have a pattern somewhat similar to the mantids that I talked about. I said with praying mantids, they're much more common to the south of us, where you have milder winters. And so at the moment, we really only see carpenter bees in like southeastern corner of Wisconsin. They do make it over here to like Dane County. I think I've had a case from Sauk County, just northwest of me a little bit, but Milwaukee, Waukesha, Washington, Ozaukee counties, you're in that part of the state where we bump into them. But you get north of that, and we really don't see those insects. I do suspect that over time, with changing climate and weather patterns, if I could look into my crystal ball and gaze 50 years in the future, wouldn't surprise me if we had carpenter bees press farther and farther north. They can be beneficial pollinators, but again, context matters. Carpenter bees, what they do is they specifically tunnel and they basically drill into softwood. So they're looking for like pine, cedar, spruce, other softer woods, perhaps, and they really like wood that is kind of raw, unfinished for the most part. And so one general recommendation is if you have something like cedar trim, cedar siding, and you have carpenter bees in your area and you're concerned about it, I mean, one thing you could do if you take the wood and you were to coat it with a fairly relatively thick coating, like a thick coat of paint or something like that, that can be a way to kind of deter them from attacking that sort of wood. Versus if you have wood that is just stained and doesn't have a particularly thick coating of varnish or stain on it, wood like that may still be or more likely to be attacked. I usually hear of damage to like cedar trim, or if someone has, say, a garden pergola or some other wooden structure in their yard that is unpainted or unfinished, those usually seem to be the things that are attacked. So, again, coating or painting that wood with a thick layer, that could be one way to potentially deter them. There are technically insecticide treatments that could be used to treat like individual holes for them. You know, hate to do that because they're beneficial insects, but if they are really damaging your trim, sometimes that might be necessary. There are also, if you go online, there's various plans to make your own or purchase them, essentially traps for carpenter bees, where it kind of attracts them into it. They fall down into a container thinking they're going into a piece of wood. So those are some options that you could try. In the grand scheme of things, though, carpenter bees, not super common unless you're in parts of southeastern Wisconsin where I'm seeing a little bit of an uptick over time.